right, welcome guys. Welcome to Jesus in the Old Testament. My name's Josh. I'm going to be teaching tonight. We're going to start with the question. When was Jesus given his name? This isn't a trick question. When did Jesus get the name Jesus? Yeah, at his birth, right? So, an angel says to Joseph, she will bear a son, you will call his name Jesus. And an angel appears to Mary and says, you're going to conceive, you're going to bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus. And just like every other child in the world, once they're born, they're officially named. Jesus was born, he was officially named Jesus, he became Jesus. So, as God though, we believe Jesus was God, which means he existed before he was actually born. What did he do?
Created the world.
We'll get there, yes. A lot of people, I think a lot of Christians don't ask that question, first of all. And a lot of Christians then just assume Jesus was floating on a cloud, nameless, somewhere in the sky, while Father God was smiting people in the Old Testament until he was ready to send his son to earth, right? But this class is called Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament, so I'm going to go ahead and spill the beans. Jesus was in the Old Testament. He just didn't have the name Jesus. And so we're going to unpack how do we find him if he's not called Jesus, and how do we make those connections. And before we even get into that, let's talk about why it matters, right? Normally we talk about this at the end. We'll come back to it at the end, but let's address why we're here in the first place anyway. New Testament writers didn't read Jesus back into the Old Testament. He was always there. So it's easy sometimes to, if you don't see Jesus in the Old Testament, you think the New Testament writers, when they're making all these quotes and they're quoting the Old Testament about Jesus, like they're just making that stuff up. They're doing new theology. And we find actually, no, they're not doing anything new. They're just revealing and continuing what was already there in the Old Testament. Second, this is important. God sent his son to save the world from the beginning. It wasn't in the New Testament when God sent his son. Yes, he did send his son in the New Testament, but he sent his son from the beginning, which means people in the Old Testament were saved the same way people in the New Testament and people today are saved, right? By faith in the Son. We give our loving loyalty to Jesus, whatever name you want to call him, right? And that's how we're saved. Same in the Old Testament, same in the New Testament. That's how Paul can say we're all children of Abraham, because we have faith, which means Abraham had to have faith in Jesus, right? Because we say there's no other name under heaven under which men must be saved. Seeing Jesus in the Old Testament also helps us understand the New Testament. There's lots of passages in the New Testament where they reference Old Testament things. And if we don't make the connection and we don't see Jesus in the Old Testament, we're going to miss and maybe even not interpret correctly what they're actually saying in the New Testament. This is Jesus' own words. He talks a lot about himself in the Old Testament. And if we're not into the lingo, we don't catch those little clues, we're going to miss what he's saying. And finally, Old Testament names, titles, and the actions of Jesus, what he does in the past, reveals who he is to us today. So when Jesus does something, right, he's the same. Yesterday, today, tomorrow. We can learn about him, how he'll respond to us, his heart and his attitude toward us when we read the stories in the past. Not just the New Testament, but also the Old Testament. So, before we go further, we got to talk about how do we read the Bible. And this could be its own class. I think it has been an equipped class before, but we're going to talk about just two things. We're going to talk about details and problems. So if I write my novel, right, Josh's great American novel, and I write a sentence, the boy sat under the tree on the hill, I might then continue to talk about that scene for another paragraph, maybe even multiple pages. And I'd tell you what clothes the boy was wearing and how old he was and the color of his hair. And I'd tell you that the tree was an old gnarly oak tree and the bark is just that real thick, rough kind of scratchy bark, not the smooth bark, but the thick one. And when he sat against the bark, he could feel it in his back, and it kind of hurt a little bit. And I'd tell you it was an early spring morning, and there was dew on the ground, and the leaves were fresh leaves that had just opened up, and they were, just that light color green, kind of slightly translucent. And I tell you all these details, and you wouldn't know whether they mattered or not. And they'd matter in that I'm just trying to get you into the story, right? Put your imagination in there. That's how we write things today. That's not how the Bible was written at all, right? The Bible, you might get the boy sat under the tree on the hill, and that's it. You don't get any other details, and so you're left wondering, who's the boy? What's his name? How old is he? Why is he sitting by the tree? Why is the tree on the hill in the first place? What time of year is it? We don't get any of that stuff. We just get really sparse details, and that's on purpose. The Bible does this so that you know that all the details matter. If a biblical writer says something, any detail, it's an important detail, and we have to pay attention to those details because they're going to make a difference. So tonight we're going to look at some stories, we're going to pay attention to details, and then the other thing we need to talk about is problems and questions. So we're taught to read. When we read a textbook at school or any book, we're taught to read for answers, right? We're looking for answers. The Bible isn't written like that. Yes, the Bible does give us answers, but not in the way that we expect. The Bible is written for us to look for problems. And those problems force us to ask questions. And then those questions lead us on a journey to eventually find the answer. So we want to read tonight looking for problems. Okay? We're going to try that? Let's try it. Let's start with a New Testament passage, John 1. We're going through the book of John as a church, so thought we might as well do some John stories. So, no one has ever seen God, the only God, who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. It's kind of weird that there's two gods here, but I want to say no one has ever seen God. We're going to camp on that phrase. Let's keep going. John 6. Now, this is Jesus' words. Before that was the Apostle John. Now it's Jesus. He says the same thing. It is written in the prophets. They'll all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father, except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. So Jesus says no one's seen God. Except one person. And then the Apostle Paul in Timothy, he says the same thing. He's talking about God. He says, he who is the blessed and only sovereign, the King of kings, Lord of lords, who alone has immortality, who dwells in unapproachable light, whom no one has ever seen or can see. To him be honor and eternal dominion. Amen. And there's other references we could look at too that say the same thing. No one has ever seen God. Where does this idea come from? Well, in the Old Testament, there's one place it comes from. It's Exodus. This is actually God speaking now. God speaking to Moses. And God says, you cannot see my face, for man shall not see me and live. So we have the apostles saying, no one's ever seen God. We have Jesus himself saying, no one's ever seen God. And now we have God saying, no one's ever seen God. What's the problem?
What's he look like?
What's he look like? Yeah. Why is there a problem with no one has ever seen God? The Bible is full of stories of people seeing God. Right? That's the whole book. The whole book is people seeing God. And they're still alive. In fact, sometimes they're really surprised that they're still alive. So here's Jacob. He's run away from home because he's done some bad stuff. And he's sleeping outside at night. He has this vision of a stairway going up to heaven. Angels are going up and down, and God appears to him. And so after the vision, Jacob names the place Peniel, which means the face of God. He says, I have seen God face to face. Seen God. And not far away, like in a distance, but face to face, up close. And yet my life has been delivered. So Jacob is surprised that he's still alive. Because he's expecting I saw God, I should be dead. Right? And we've looked at verses that say, no one has ever seen God. You can't see God and live. Yet Jacob got to do it. How? It's a mystery, right? Deuteronomy, Moses speaking. Now Moses is speaking to the people of Israel. This is after the Exodus, and they've been to Mount Sinai, and they've seen God. And he's reminding them of when they actually saw God. He says, the Lord spoke with you face to face at the mountain, out of the midst of the fire, while I stood between the Lord and you at the time to declare to you the word of the Lord. So he says, you saw God face to face. And yet you said, the people responded, they said, behold, our God has shown us his glory and greatness. We've heard his voice out of the midst of the fire, and this day we have seen God. So not only did we hear him, we saw him. We saw him speak with man, and man still live. Now, therefore, why should we die? So they're asking, for this great fire will consume us. We've heard the voice of God. If we hear God anymore, we're going to die. In other words, they're worried, hey, we saw God. Somehow we were able to live. We don't want to push our luck anymore and keep seeing him, because surely at some point our luck's going to run out and we're going to die. All right. The prophets are the same way too. Here's just one example. Isaiah has a vision of God. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on the throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. On and on, he talks about it, and he says, woe is me. He says, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah is worried, and he's fearful. Why is he afraid? Because he thinks he's going to die because he saw God, right? Because the Bible tells us over and over again, no one can see God and live. Yet, over and over, people do. So, here's our question. Right? We've come up to a problem, and now we have to ask about it. The problem is, how can the Bible affirm the truth that no one can see God, and yet it's chock full of stories of people seeing God? Right? This is intentional. This is on purpose. Everything in the Bible is written on purpose. And we're meant to ask questions. So we should be asking this question. We're going to pause there, and let's look at another question. We're going to come up with another problem. Deuteronomy 6. The Shema is a prayer that the Jews pray every morning and every evening. Twice a day they repeat this. And this is how the prayer starts. This isn't the whole prayer. It's just the beginning of it. It's a quote from Deuteronomy 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. So every day, twice a day, they repeat, God is one. There's one God. One God. Here's my question. How can a bunch of Jews who affirm this, that God is one, how can they also believe that Jesus is God? Now, if you come from a Muslim background, you come up with the same problem, right? If you're from a Muslim faith, you believe there's only one God. Allah is one. And this is the biggest hurdle for a Muslim coming to faith, is the claims of deity of Jesus. They see Jesus as a good prophet. They say he can't be God because there's only one. But the New Testament doesn't explain it. It just kind of assumes that we get it. It talks about Jesus being God and just it doesn't waste much time explaining how there could be two in one. All right? And we had to, over the centuries, Christians had to kind of unpack the theology of the Trinity. The Bible didn't spell it out for us. We had to kind of figure it out based on the text. The Bible just assumed. How can Jews who over and over say there's only one God believe that Jesus is one? So I heard a popular Bible teacher teaching on this, and they said, well, it has to be the resurrection. The resurrection's the answer. And I'm going to tell you that that's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is a lot of Jews believed in Jesus as God while Jesus was still on earth before he died and was resurrected. Jesus claimed over and over again, I'm God, I'm one with the Father. We unpacked some of this in John, right? Each Sunday, Jim or Lee or Kevin, the different teachers will unpack. It's like every week, Jesus is making a claim that he's God. And the disciples, they agree and they believe him, and some of the crowd believes him, some people don't, but they never go back to there's only one God. That's not the argument. The argument is you're not the guy. So we're going to talk about an ancient Jewish tradition. It's called the two powers in heaven. This tradition was outlawed in the 2nd century AD. Can you think what happened around that time? What was going on in the 2nd century? Well, the Jews had lost the temple, right? And there was this new sect of Judaism that was growing exponentially. And they were called Christians. And they believed that there was God the Father and God the Son, and they believed the Son was named Jesus, and he had come and died and been resurrected. And so a bunch of rabbis got together, and they say, we've got to outlaw this teaching called the two powers. So we're going to unpack the two powers, because this is an ancient tradition. Philo was a Jew. He lived about the same time as Jesus. They were contemporaries. Philo probably never met Jesus, never even heard of him. He grew up and lived his life in Alexandria, Egypt, and Jesus was in Israel. They'd never overlapped. It's doubtful that there was ever, like Jesus probably didn't know about Philo. Philo probably didn't know about Jesus. So Philo wrote a commentary on Genesis. And so he wrote on Genesis 9:6. This is Genesis 9:6. This is God speaking to Noah. And God says, whoever sheds human blood, by human shall that one's blood be shed. For in the image of God was humankind made. All right. Philo's going to do the things that we've talked about in reading the Bible. He's going to notice details and notice problems. So we're going to see how he does it, and then we're going to practice doing it, okay? So here's Philo's comments. Philo says, why is it that he speaks as if there is some other God, saying that he made man after the image of God, and not that he made him after his own image? Are you tracking? Right? This is God speaking, and he talks about God in third person. I'm not an English major. I remember, though, like first person, second person, third person, right? This is God talking about himself. This is when I start talking about Josh, it's kind of weird, not normal. Kings sometimes do it. Really narcissistic people maybe sometimes do it. But it doesn't come across well, right? It's better if I say me and I, right? But this is God talking about God in third person, and Philo notices. Little detail, we just read right on past that, we don't notice. Philo sees and he asks the question. And then he answers the question. So here's his answer. No mortal thing, so no physical thing, right? No human, could have been formed on the similitude is similarity, the likeness. No human could have been formed on the likeness of the Supreme Father of the universe, because no one has ever seen God, right? But only after the pattern of the second deity. So Philo has identified two gods, a Supreme Father and a second deity, who he calls the Logos, or the Word, of the Supreme Being. So Philo's a Jew. He's going to say the Shema. He's going to say God is one. But he also says that God is two. Two in one. Does that sound familiar? And one of them's called the Word. And he flows out of the other one. One's called the Father, one's called the Word. So here's the two powers in heaven. When you read ancient Jewish texts, we just picked one. We just picked Philo. There's a bunch of them that talk about this. We're going to kind of look at the description. So the first power is the Father that Philo talked about. He's invisible. He's transcendent or above, right? He sends another power, and he is God. The second power of heaven, he's a little different. He's visible and near. People can see him. Now, the Jews get this. They get this theology by reading their Old Testament, right? They read their Bible. This is how they come up with theology. The second power, he's sent by the first power. So the first power sends, the second power is sent. And the second power is God too. But the second power is also distinct from God. So not every Jew believed this, right? Judaism back in the first century was just as diverse and complex, maybe even more so, as Christianity today, right? You might be Protestant, you might be Catholic, you might be Greek Orthodox, and theology views range a bunch. But there was at least a prominent group of Jews who believed this and followed this, and they got this from the Old Testament. So, this visible God, we're going to talk about him, the second power. The writers of the Old Testament intentionally blur the lines when they tell the stories. And they force us to wrestle with his identity. Is he God Is he not God? Is he distinct from God? Or is he one with God? Which one is he? This sounds a lot like someone we know and worship, doesn't it? When we read our New Testament. He's sent by God as his messenger. An angel just means a messenger. In the Old Testament, the word angel, it's a job. It's not a type of person. It's your job or your role. So this second power, he's an angel, and he's a messenger. He's sent. He's able to appear to people without them dying. That's a key thing, right? Because over and over we're told like no one can see God and live, but this God, this second power, you can see and live. He can speak about God in the third person. We'll see that a lot. But he can also speak about God in the first person, as if he himself is God. It's really confusing. Which one is it? The Bible is intentionally making us wrestle with his identity. And he accepts worship from humans. So most angels, we'll read stories in the Bible of an angel appearing to someone, that person will fall down and start to worship the angel, and the angel will say, no, don't worship me, only worship God, right? But this angel, this second power, he accepts worship from humans. And humans who interact with him, they often refer to him explicitly as God. So that's this second power, this visible power. And this visible God, he's given lots of names and lots of titles in the Old Testament. He's referred to lots of different ways. These are some of the names that he gets, not all of them, but the big ones. He's called the angel. YHWH is the name for God in the Old Testament. We sometimes translate that as Yahweh or as Jehovah. Often in our Bibles, it's translated as Lord, all caps. We're not exactly sure what the vowels are. We know the consonants. And so, but our Bibles usually say the angel of the Lord, right? Or the second name he gets often is the word of the Lord. He's called the glory of the Lord, or just the glory, sometimes just the word, right? You could add of the Lord on the end of most of these. He's called the name of the Lord, right? The name of the Lord is a strong tower. Well, it's a person. The name is a person. The face or the presence. In Hebrew, the face and the presence are the same word. It can mean both things. The judge. We'll look at a story in a little bit about the judge. He's called the right arm or the hand, or the arm of the Lord, the hand of the Lord. He's called the prince or the commander. This isn't of the Lord, but this is of the heavenly host or of the angel armies, the commander of the armies of heaven. He's called wisdom. This happens a lot in the Proverbs, where wisdom's personified as a person. He's called the shepherd. That reminds us of Jesus saying, I'm the good shepherd, right? And he's called the Son, and Jesus often calls himself the Son. So all these names, Old Testament writers switch them mid-story. We might start with the angel of the Lord, and then all of a sudden it's the glory or the name of the Lord, and then it's just the Lord. Sometimes they'll just say God. They're switching these names all around, trying to force us to wrestle with the question, who is he? And ask, see the problems, ask the questions. All right. This slide and this slide are the same, except I changed the title. This is Jesus in the Old Testament. Jesus goes by all these names. And anytime you have language that points to a visible appearance of God, it's going to be Jesus. We know it's not the Father, and it's not the Spirit. It's going to be Jesus. So that's my theory, and it's actually not my theory. We'll see that it's actually been taught throughout church history. But there it is. If this is all this is the money thing right here. You can go home right now if you want to. But we're going to unpack some stories about this.